My name is Colleen Anderson, and I was 34 years old the day I buried the only person who ever truly raised me. His name was Walter Kesler. My grandfather. The man who taught me how to sand a board so it wouldn't splinter, how to balance a checkbook to the penny, and how to show up for people even when it cost you something. At his funeral, 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty the whole service. Chairs I had saved for my parents. Chairs they never sat in. But what they posted online, 3 hours later, and the text that arrived from my dead grandfather's own phone, that's where this story really begins. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is the channel where we sit with the quiet betrayals that happen inside families, and the women who finally stop shrinking to keep the peace. If a story like this one has ever lived inside your own house, you already know how heavy a folded flag can feel in your hands. Drop a comment if you've ever kept a chair saved for someone who never came, and make sure you're subscribed, because this one gets harder before it gets better, and I want you here for the whole thing. I remember standing at the front of that little chapel, watching the room fill up with people who loved him. Neighbors. Old customers. A man he'd taught to build a porch back in 1994, who drove 2 hours just to stand in the back and cry quietly into a paper program. Everyone showed up. Everyone except the 2 people who shared his blood and my last name. And then, right there in the pew, my phone buzzed against my leg. I looked down, and the ground tilted under me. To understand that buzz, you have to understand the man in the box at the front of the room. My parents left when I was 7. Not left the room. Left. Roy and Denise Anderson had places to be, apparently, and a little girl was in the way of getting there. They set me down the way you set down an old coat you don't plan on wearing again. So Walter took me in. He was 51 then, a retired carpenter with sawdust worked so deep into the creases of his hands it never fully washed out, and he did not sigh once. He didn't make it a production. He just made up the spare room, hung a curtain with little sailboats on it because that's what the store had, and bought a night light shaped like a moon so I wouldn't be scared of the dark in a house that wasn't supposed to be mine yet somehow became the only one that ever was. He came to every single thing. Every school play, even the ones where I forgot my one line and just stood there red-faced while the whole gymnasium waited. Every softball game where I struck out looking, 3 pitches, never even swung, and he still clapped like I'd hit it out of the county. Every parent-teacher night, folding his 6-foot frame into a chair built for a 9-year-old, knees up near his ears, taking notes on the back of a folded gas station receipt because that's what was in his pocket. My mother sent a card on my birthday when she happened to remember which month it fell in. Some years it came in March. My birthday is in June. Walter never missed a day. Not one, in 27 years. When I was 9, I asked him why my parents didn't want me. I remember exactly where we were, his kitchen, the yellow linoleum, him drinking coffee out of a mug that said "World's Okayest Fisherman" that some customer had given him as a joke. He set that coffee down slow, like the question deserved him putting something down for it, and he said something I carried with me my whole life afterward. "Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart," he said. "The rest is just noise. Love isn't a speech. It's a person in a chair." And for 27 years, he was the person in the chair. He walked me down the aisle when I married Sam, in a rented suit that didn't quite fit him through the shoulders, crying so hard the pastor had to pause. He held my daughter Nora an hour after she was born, this huge, weathered carpenter's hand cupping her whole head like she was the most fragile piece of furniture he'd ever been trusted with, and he cried without a shred of shame about it. So no, I was not confused about who my family was. Which is exactly why, in that last hard week of his life, the week he needed me most, the thing that still keeps me up some nights is that I got there late. Not late to his bedside. Late to understanding what was actually happening in that house. The cancer came for his pancreas, which is the kind that doesn't negotiate with anybody. By spring, the chemo had hollowed him out until his shirts hung off him like they were still on the hanger. I drove the 20 minutes to his house every single evening after I closed my books for the day. I keep the ledgers for half the small businesses in our town, so numbers have always been my whole trade, the language I think in when everything else gets too loud. I'd make him toast he couldn't manage to finish, and we'd watch the same westerns we'd watched 100 times before, the ones where you already know every line of dialogue and it doesn't matter because the company is the point. That was when my mother reappeared. Denise, who had been living in Florida and only ever surfaced when there was something worth surfacing for, suddenly flew up to help Daddy. She took over his mail. She took over his bank. When I offered, gently, professionally, the way I'd offer any client, to sit down and help organize his accounts, which is, again, my actual profession, she gave me that tight little smile of hers and said, "Daddy wants his privacy, Colleen." I pushed, because something in me already didn't trust the smile. I asked to be added to the account just so I could watch for fraud, the way any accountant, any granddaughter, any person who loved him would. She told me he'd set it up his way and it wasn't my place. And here is the part one still turn over at 3 in the morning sometimes. I was suspicious. I asked the right questions. I even called his bank myself, and they told me, correctly, that only the account holder or his power of attorney could discuss it, and his power of attorney was Denise. There was a wall built around him, and it had my mother's signature on it, and there was nothing I could legally reach across. So I told myself she was his daughter. I told myself grief was making me paranoid, that I was looking for a villain because a villain would at least explain why this felt so wrong. I brought him soup. I kept my mouth shut. And I trusted the wrong thing. 3 weeks later, he was gone. And I still didn't know what she'd been hiding behind that tight little smile. He died on a Tuesday, at home, with me holding his hand and a nurse named Grace on the other side of the bed. Denise had flown back to Florida 4 days earlier, because, and I am quoting her exactly, she couldn't just sit around waiting. So I planned the funeral alone. I picked the hymns he used to hum while he sanded. I wrote the obituary at my own kitchen table at 2 in the morning while Sam slept upstairs, crossing out sentences that felt too small for a man that big. I called the church. I called the florist. I called the man who digs the graves, a quiet fellow named Ellis who'd known Walter 30 years and told me on the phone, voice cracking, that he'd dig that one for free. And then I called my mother to tell her the date. There was a pause. Pool noises in the background, a splash, a kid laughing, someone calling out for a towel. And she said they couldn't make it back in time. Flights were expensive this time of year. Daddy would understand. They'd say a prayer down there. I sat with the phone against my ear a long time after she hung up, just listening to the dial tone like it might explain something. I thought about Walter in his child-sized chair at every single recital of my life. I thought about the receipt he took notes on at parent-teacher conferences. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. He'd said it so many times it lived in me like a heartbeat. And his own daughter couldn't find a flight. Something in me just went quiet. The way you go quiet when a number won't reconcile no matter how many times you run it, you stop being surprised and start being careful. I told myself 2 empty chairs at a funeral was the worst thing they could do to me. I told myself it couldn't get any lower than a daughter skipping her own father's grave. I was wrong about that. I was so wrong. The lowest thing was still 3 hours away, and it was already loaded onto a boat and waiting on a beach in the Caribbean. The funeral was on a gray Saturday, the kind of morning where the sky can't quite decide whether to rain or not and just sits there, heavy, undecided. I got there early, and I saved 2 chairs in the front row. I don't fully know why. Hope is a stubborn animal, even when you've fed it nothing for years. I set a folded program on each seat, smoothing the crease with my thumb, and I waited for a daughter who wasn't coming. The chapel filled up behind me. I turned around once, and my breath caught in my chest, because the room was packed. There was the Delgado family, whose fence he'd rebuilt for free after the flood 2 summers back, 3 of them standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisle because the pews were already full. There was old Mr. Apprentice, that's genuinely what everyone called him, though I never did learn if it was a nickname or his actual last name, crying into a handkerchief the size of a dish towel. There was a woman I didn't recognize at all, who found me afterward and told me, holding both my hands in hers, that Walter had taught her late husband his entire trade, every joint, every measurement, for free, over the course of a whole winter, and that they never once forgot it. Half the town came out for a retired carpenter. And 2 chairs in the front row stayed empty, with 2 little folded programs sitting on them like place cards for ghosts who'd RSVP'd and never shown. The pastor spoke about a life measured in what you build for other people rather than what you keep for yourself. Grace, the nurse, squeezed my shoulder from the pew behind me. I stood up to read the words I'd written at 2 in the morning, and my voice held, because Walter's granddaughter does not fall apart in public. He raised me steadier than that, on purpose, the same way he squared every corner he ever cut. I sat back down. I looked at those 2 empty chairs one more time. And that was the exact moment my phone buzzed in my black coat pocket. I almost didn't look. I nearly let it go to voicemail out of sheer instinct, the reflex of a woman who has learned that most things buzzing at a funeral are not urgent. But I did look. And it was a photo. My mother in a turquoise sarong, holding a drink with a little paper umbrella sticking out of it. My father grinning behind her, sunburned and pleased with himself, one arm slung loose around her shoulders. White sand. A blue ocean that only seems to exist in vacation brochures and screensavers. And underneath, in her own cheerful handwriting on the caption, for words I will hear for the rest of my life. Living our best life. Posted publicly. Timestamped 11 minutes into her own father's funeral. My hand went cold around the phone. I don't remember the rest of the service. I genuinely do not. I remember the parking lot afterward, sitting behind the wheel of my car with the engine off, staring at that photo until the screen went dark on its own, and then turning it back on and staring at it again, like it might change if I looked hard enough. Living our best life. Their best life, while I lowered their father into the ground 20 feet away. I have spent my whole career being calm about other people's disasters. A missing invoice, a blown budget, a client crying about a tax bill they didn't see coming. I am the steady one. The one who says, let's look at the numbers, let's figure out where this actually stands. But sitting in that parking lot, I could not find one single steady thought in my head. I kept doing the math on the timeline instead, because that's what I do when I can't feel anything else, I count. She'd posted it 11 minutes in, which meant she had been dressing for the beach, choosing a filter, thinking about her caption, at the exact hour she knew we'd be singing his favorite hymn. That was not forgetting. Forgetting doesn't require that much preparation. That was a decision, made in advance, with wardrobe. I almost didn't look. I nearly let it go to voicemail out of sheer instinct, the reflex of a woman who has learned that most things buzzing at a funeral are not urgent. But I did look. And it was a photo. My mother in a turquoise sarong, holding a drink with a little paper umbrella sticking out of it. My father grinning behind her, sunburned and pleased with himself, one arm slung loose around her shoulders. White sand. A blue ocean that only seems to exist in vacation brochures and screensavers. And underneath, in her own cheerful handwriting on the caption, for words I will hear for the rest of my life. Living our best life. Posted publicly. Timestamped 11 minutes into her own father's funeral. My hand went cold around the phone. I don't remember the rest of the service. I genuinely do not. I remember the parking lot afterward, sitting behind the wheel of my car with the engine off, staring at that photo until the screen went dark on its own, and then turning it back on and staring at it again, like it might change if I looked hard enough. Living our best life. Their best life, while I lowered their father into the ground 20 feet away. I have spent my whole career being calm about other people's disasters. A missing invoice, a blown budget, a client crying about a tax bill they didn't see coming. I am the steady one. The one who says, let's look at the numbers, let's figure out where this actually stands. But sitting in that parking lot, I could not find one single steady thought in my head. I kept doing the math on the timeline instead, because that's what I do when I can't feel anything else, I count. She'd posted it 11 minutes in, which meant she had been dressing for the beach, choosing a filter, thinking about her caption, at the exact hour she knew we'd be singing his favorite hymn. That was not forgetting. Forgetting doesn't require that much preparation. That was a decision made in advance, with wardrobe. I was still holding the phone, still staring at that ocean, when it buzzed again in my hand. A text this time. From a contact saved in my phone under one word, Grandpa. His number. The number I had called every single night for months, sometimes twice, just to hear him say he was fine even when his voice had gone thin as paper. The number that had gone quiet on Tuesday afternoon, the exact moment a nurse named Grace pulled a sheet up to his chin and I stopped being able to breathe right for a while. And now it lit up my screen like nothing had happened at all. Sweetheart, come to my house right now. I read it 4 times. My grandfather was in the ground behind me, not even fully covered yet, probably, if I let myself think about it, which I didn't. I had watched him die with my own eyes, held his hand while the machine went flat. There was no version of the world, no glitch or grief hallucination or cruel coincidence, where that particular phone should be sending me anything at all. My skin went to goosebumps under the black wool of my coat. I looked back toward the cemetery, then down at his name glowing on my screen, and I did the only thing his granddaughter could possibly do. I turned the key. Walter's house sat 20 minutes out of town on a road that turns to gravel right at the mailbox, the kind of road where your tires know the potholes before your eyes do. I made it in 15. The whole drive, my hands wouldn't quite stop shaking on the wheel, and I kept the radio off, and I told myself all the reasonable things a person tells themselves when reality has just done something it isn't supposed to do. A wrong number. A glitch in some carrier's system. Somebody's idea of a cruel joke, though I couldn't imagine who would want to play it, or why, on this particular day. There's a box, Harold said quietly. He wanted you to have it. Only you. He was very specific about that part, Colleen. Not your mother. Not the family. You. The box was an old cigar box, the kind he used to keep screws and washers in, sorted by size, because Walter never once in his life threw a usable thing away. My name was on the lid in his shaky block letters, the handwriting of a man whose hand had started betraying him months before the rest of him did. Inside were 3 things. A journal with a soft blue cover, worn pale at the corners from handling. A thick stack of bank statements, photocopied and paperclipped by month, in order, the way I would have organized them myself if he'd let me. And a folder holding a copy of a legal document I recognized before I could even read the title, because I have filed 100 just like it for clients over the years. A durable power of attorney. Denise's name on the signature line. I looked up at Harold. He folded his hands on the table, the way a man does when he's about to say something he's been dreading saying. Your grandfather didn't trust his daughter, he said quietly. Not at the end. He wanted you to have the truth, Colleen. Not just the grief. He said you were the only one who'd know what to do with numbers. And the only one who ever showed up. I ran my thumb over the blue cover of the journal. I could feel, even through the cover, the ridges where a shaking hand had pressed too hard on the pages underneath, over and over. I did not open it yet. I wasn't ready. But standing there in his kitchen holding that box, I understood clearly that my life had just split into a before and an after, and there was no gluing it back together into one piece again. Do you know what's in it? I asked Harold. The journal? He shook his head slowly. He wouldn't let me read it. Said it was mine to deliver, not mine to know. But Colleen, he hesitated, and for a lawyer, 30 years in the business, hesitating did not come naturally to him. He called me twice in his last month. Scared. Not about dying. About something else. He wouldn't say what, exactly, not straight out. But he asked me, both times, whether a man could still protect somebody even after he was gone. I told him the truth. I told him it depended entirely on what he left behind. I closed the lid of the box very carefully, like it might spill. If you've ever been handed grief and paperwork in the very same breath, you already know how loud a quiet kitchen can get around you. Stay with me, because this is the moment I stopped being the girl who just kept the peace no matter the cost. Drop a comment below with the word showing up if there's someone in your own life who always did, no matter what it cost them, and subscribe, because what I found in those pages is the entire reason my mother is exactly where she is today. I thanked Harold. I told him I'd call him once I'd read it, whatever it turned out to be. And I drove that blue journal home like it was a live thing riding on the seat beside me, one hand on the wheel and one hand resting flat on the cover the entire way, as if it might try to leave. Sam was up when I got home, waiting in the kitchen with the lamp on low so it wouldn't wake Nora, who had finally fallen asleep after asking me 4 times that day where Grandpa Walter had gone and not being satisfied with any answer I gave her. Sam took one look at the box under my arm and my face above it, and he put the kettle on without a word, because that's who he is, an electrician by trade, a man who wants the world to be fixable, and who knows enough to wait before asking what's broken. I told him about the beach photo first, because it was easier, even though it wasn't easy at all. I told him about the text from a dead man's phone. He sat down slow, the way you sit when your legs have decided on their own that standing isn't safe anymore. Then I opened the journal. Walter's handwriting had always been square and sure, a carpenter's hand, the kind that measures twice out of habit rather than doubt. But these pages started strong and got worse. Line by line, entry by entry, the letters loosened as the chemo took more and more of his grip, until by the middle of the book his sentences tilted downhill like a house settling wrong on its foundation. The early entries were just a sick man's diary, and reading them nearly undid me before I even got to the part that mattered. Bad night. Grace changed the dressing, said the sights healing slow. Colleen brought soup, the good kind, didn't tell her I could only get down 4 spoonfuls. Stayed for the western, the one with the train robbery, she's seen it 11 times and still gasps at the same part. Good girl. Best thing that ever walked up my porch steps. I had to stop reading out loud there. Sam reached over and took my hand, and I let him, and after a minute I kept going, because Walter never once stopped in the middle of a job just because it got hard, and I wasn't about to start now, on his behalf, with his own words. Then, a few weeks in, the tone changed. Money's tight again, he'd written, the letters already looser than the entry before it. And I don't know why. Denise says I spent it. Maybe I did. I get so tired lately. I can't always remember what I've done in a day, let alone a month. But it doesn't feel right. Nothing about it feels right. I read that line 3 times. My grandfather never lost track of a nickel in his entire life. He kept receipts sorted in a shoebox by decade, going back to 1974, because he liked to be able to prove, on demand, exactly where every dollar he'd ever earned had gone. And here he was, in his own failing hand, wondering aloud where his savings had disappeared to, while his daughter told him, calmly, patiently, the way you'd correct a confused old man, that he'd simply spent it himself and forgotten. Sam read over my shoulder and went very still beside me. The kettle screamed from the stove, and neither one of us moved to take it off. Somewhere in these pages, I already understood, was the exact shape of the thing that had built a wall around a dying man and kept his own granddaughter out of it. I turned to the next entry. My hands were steadier now, because numbers are the one place I never lose my nerve, even when everything else is shaking, and Walter, God bless him, God rest him, had started keeping his own. The middle of the journal was where a scared old man turned into a careful one, and reading that turn happen, page by page, was one of the hardest things I have ever done in my life, harder in some ways than the funeral itself, because a funeral is grief you can see coming. This was grief hiding inside something that looked, at first glance, like ordinary bookkeeping. After that first brutal round of chemo, Walter wrote that Denise had sat him down at this very table and told him his mind wasn't safe anymore. That he needed help managing things. That she'd take the burden off him, since he had enough to carry just staying alive. So he'd signed the durable power of attorney right there, at his own kitchen table, the day after a treatment that had left him too weak to even lift a spoon to his own mouth without his hand trembling half the soup onto his shirt. She had brought the papers pre-filled, he wrote, already knowing exactly where he needed to sign. He signed because she was his daughter, and he was frightened and tired, and because a father wants, more than almost anything else in this world, to believe that his own child is reaching out a hand to help him and not reaching into his pocket while she does it. Then the entries started listing amounts, and this is where the diary of a dying man became, without him fully realizing it yet, the beginning of an evidence file. 400 out on the 9th, he wrote. Didn't buy anything myself that I can recall. 600 on the 15th, Grace drove me to the pharmacy that day, cost me $40 total for the whole visit, prescription and all. That's every cent I spent that entire week, and I know it, because I asked Grace to write down the total for me on a napkin, since my own numbers weren't sitting right in my head anymore, and even a scared man can still ask somebody he trusts to help him check his own math. He'd begun to notice the gaps. He'd begun, in his weakest and most frightened months, to keep a private tally, because some deep, stubborn part of the man who never lost a nickel in 80-some years of living knew exactly what he was watching happen to him, even when his own daughter told him nightly that he was imagining it. She thinks I'm too far gone to count, he wrote near the bottom of one page, the letters dragging sideways like his hand had wanted to stop but he wouldn't let it. I'm not. I just can't stop her. The bank won't talk to me anymore, not really, not about anything that matters. They talk to her now. She's the one on the paper. And then, underneath that, pressed so hard into the page that the pen had nearly torn straight through it, I gave her the key to the house. And she took the house. Not the building. Everything else that was ever inside it. I set the journal down on the table and just breathed for a minute, both hands flat against the wood the way he used to teach me to check a board for warp. Then I looked at the stack of photocopied statements he'd left me, month after month, clipped together in perfect order. 400 out on the 9th, he wrote. Didn't buy anything myself that I can recall. 600 on the 15th, Grace drove me to the pharmacy that day, cost me $40 total for the whole visit, prescription and all. That's every cent I spent that entire week, and I know it, because I asked Grace to write down the total for me on a napkin, since my own numbers weren't sitting right in my head anymore, and even a scared man can still ask somebody he trusts to help him check his own math. He'd begun to notice the gaps. He'd begun, in his weakest and most frightened months, to keep a private tally, because some deep, stubborn part of the man who never lost a nickel in 80-some years of living knew exactly what he was watching happen to him, even when his own daughter told him nightly that he was imagining it. She thinks I'm too far gone to count, he wrote near the bottom of one page, the letters dragging sideways like his hand had wanted to stop but he wouldn't let it. I'm not. I just can't stop her. The bank won't talk to me anymore, not really, not about anything that matters. They talk to her now. She's the one on the paper. And then, underneath that, pressed so hard into the page that the pen had nearly torn straight through it, I gave her the key to the house. And she took the house. 400 out on the 9th, he wrote. Didn't buy anything myself that I can recall. 600 on the 15th, Grace drove me to the pharmacy that day, cost me $40 total for the whole visit, prescription and all. That's every cent I spent that entire week, and I know it, because I asked Grace to write down the total. He'd left me a map. All I had to do was follow it. I spread the statements across my own dining table the next morning, the way I do for any client audit, oldest to newest, left to right, no exceptions, because chaos in the paperwork is usually just chaos somebody wants you to feel so you'll stop looking closely. This is the part of my job most people find unbearably boring. I have always found it honest. Numbers don't have a side to take. They don't love you, and they don't lie to you, no matter how much you might want them to do either one. They just sit there on the page and tell you, plainly, exactly what happened. And what happened to Walter Kesler was written in plain black ink, transfer by transfer, going back nearly a full year. Starting the month after the power of attorney was signed, money began leaving his savings account in steady, deliberate bites. Not medical bills. I cross-checked every single hospital charge and every pharmacy receipt myself, matched them line for line, and those were small, and separate, and entirely accounted for elsewhere. These were transfers. Electronic. Clean. Regular, almost rhythmic, moving from his account into an account ending in the same 4 digits, over and over again, month after month. Some months it was $3,000. Some months it climbed as high as 11. A loan here, a reimbursement there, though I could not find one single receipt, one single item, one solitary thing she had ever actually bought for a man dying by inches in a house 20 minutes from mine. And every few weeks, without fail, his own life savings walked quietly out the door and flew south to Florida. I built a spreadsheet the way I have built 10,000 of them over the years, and I watched the running total climb up the right-hand column like a fever chart nobody was checking. Sam brought me coffee at midnight without a word, then again around 2, and didn't say anything either time, because he knows the particular look on my face when the numbers start telling a story I'm not going to like the ending of. Around 1 in the morning, I finally sat back and pressed both hands flat against the table just to stop them from shaking, because grief does that to you. It makes you doubt your own eyes. Makes you wonder if you're twisting the facts to fit a shape you already decided on, makes you feel, for a while, like you might genuinely be the crazy one in the story. But numbers don't grieve. They don't have an agenda. They just tell the truth, calmly, in the same font, whether you want to hear it or not. And the truth was climbing that column faster than I wanted it to, faster than felt survivable, faster than a man on a fixed retirement income and a modest pension should ever have been losing money in the final year of his life. Before I did anything else, I called her. I owe myself that much, at least, to say out loud, so nobody watching this ever thinks I skipped the step where I tried to be reasonable first. I gave my own mother a chance to explain herself before I let a single number leave that spreadsheet and become anything more serious than my private grief. I sat in my car the next morning, in my own driveway, because I didn't want Nora anywhere near the house for whatever this call turned into. I dialed Florida with a hand that was, for once, almost steady. Denise answered bright and breezy, still riding the tail end of her tan, her voice pitched for a woman with nothing on her conscience. I kept my own voice level, the way I would with any client I suspected of something before I had proof. I told her I'd been going through Grandpa's papers, settling his estate the way somebody had to, and that there were some withdrawals I couldn't account for. I asked her plainly, professionally, what the transfers into her account had actually been for. The warmth dropped straight out of her voice, like a trap door opening underneath a stage. "That is none of your business," she said. "I was the one settling his affairs, Colleen. Not you." A short, ugly little laugh followed, one I hadn't heard from her since I was a child and had said something she found beneath answering. "His affairs are family business." And last I checked, she let that land deliberately, like she'd been saving it. "You're not really family, are you?" I said nothing. I let her keep going, the way you let a client dig their own hole a little deeper during an audit, because the deeper they dig on their own, the less digging you have to do yourself later in front of a judge. "He felt sorry for you," she said. "That's all it ever was, all your whole life, and you were too young and too grateful to see it. You want the truth? You are his charity case, Colleen. Not his blood. His blood is me. And what's mine is mine." Then she hung up on me. I sat in my driveway with the phone still against my ear for a long time after the line went dead, listening to nothing at all. Charity case, not his blood. She'd handed me the exact sentence she thought would break me clean in half, the one sentence designed, precisely, to make me sit back down, go quiet, and stay small and grateful for whatever scraps she decided I deserved. 20 years earlier, it would have worked exactly the way she intended. But I wasn't 9 years old anymore, sitting at a table hoping to be chosen. And I had a spreadsheet sitting open on my own dining room table that didn't care one bit whose blood ran through anybody's veins. I went back inside, and I picked up his journal, and I called Harold, and I asked him to explain the power of attorney to me the way you'd explain it to a jury, not to an accountant who already understood the mechanics but needed to hear, out loud, exactly how much trouble it put my mother in. He met me at his office the next morning, a cluttered little room above the hardware store with law books stacked on every flat surface and a window unit that rattled the whole time we talked. He laid it out straight, no softening it for my sake, which I appreciated more than he probably knew. A durable power of attorney, he said, doesn't make you an owner of anything. It makes you a fiduciary. That's the entire point of the document, Colleen, the whole reason it exists. She was legally required, by law, to act in his interest and only his interest, not her own. Every single dollar she moved out of that account had to be for Walter. For his care. For his bills. For his comfort. She could not lend it to herself. She could not gift it to herself. She could not reimburse herself for things she never actually bought him. Doing any of that isn't a family disagreement you settle over Thanksgiving dinner. That's a breach of fiduciary duty. And past a certain dollar amount, taking from an elder that way has a name the state takes very, very seriously. I asked him, my voice steadier than I expected, what I could actually do about it. He rubbed his eyes behind his glasses, the way a man does when he's about to hand somebody news that will cost them something no matter which direction they choose. You can petition the probate court for a formal accounting, he said. That forces her to open the books and justify every transfer in writing, under oath, within 30 days. If she can't, and from everything you've shown me here this morning, Colleen, she can't, that failure becomes evidence in itself. And at that point it isn't just civil anymore. At that point it can go to the prosecutor. He looked at me over the top of his glasses then, and his voice, for the first time that morning, actually softened. But I want you to hear the rest of it clearly before you decide anything. This is your mother. You start this, and there is no quiet way to finish it. You could send her to prison, Colleen. Family doesn't come back from that. Not ever, not really. I thanked him, and I drove home with the whole shape of it finally clear in front of me, the way a blueprint finally makes sense once you've stared at it long enough. There was a legal road. It ran straight through my mother. And I hadn't decided yet whether I actually had it in me to walk it. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I went back to the journal, further than I'd let myself read before, into the last entries where his handwriting barely held itself together anymore. And near the very end, pressed flat between 2 pages like a leaf someone had tried to preserve, I found a folded scrap of paper. It was a page torn from his prescription pad, the kind the pharmacy stapled a fresh one to every refill. On it, in that failing carpenter's hand, he'd written 4 account numbers. His savings. His checking. A CD. And one I didn't recognize at all. Beneath them, one single line, if you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them. And I'm sorry. I sat on the edge of the bed and read it until the words went blurry and I had to blink them back into focus. He'd known. That was the thing that undid me more than the beach photo, more than the 2 empty chairs, more than any of it. He had known exactly what his daughter was doing to him while it was happening, and he had been too weak, and too walled off by that power of attorney, to stop it himself. And instead of simply giving up, the way a frightened, dying man would have every right to, he had quietly, patiently built a case against her from inside a cigar box, and handed the whole thing to the one grandchild he trusted with it. He'd torn a page off a prescription pad, a dying man's most disposable piece of paper, the kind you'd normally crumple and toss, and turned it into a key. And that I'm sorry sat on my chest like a stone I couldn't put down. He was apologizing to me, as if being betrayed by his own daughter was somehow a thing he had done to me, rather than a thing done to us both, together, by the same person. I pressed the scrap flat inside the journal's back cover, where I'd never lose it, and I understood exactly what he'd left me, and exactly why. He hadn't left me grief. He'd left me instructions. For account numbers and one line, from a man who was never once wrong about people in his entire life. I put the note somewhere safe, and somewhere between that line and the sunrise, without ever deciding it out loud, I stopped grieving quite so hard and started counting instead. Because he'd been keeping his own numbers for a reason. Now it was my turn to finish them. With the fourth account number from his note, I finally had the whole picture, because that last unfamiliar account turned out to be a certificate of deposit he'd been building for over 40 years. His real nest egg. The one he'd always meant to leave to something good. He used to say that exact phrase to me when I was a teenager, something good, never specifying what, like he wanted the decision to stay open until the right moment arrived. I pulled every record Harold could legally request on my behalf, and I added the CD into my spreadsheet, and I watched the running total jump in a way that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. She hadn't just been skimming his monthly savings a little at a time. Somewhere during one of his weakest months, while he was too sick to even sign his own name steady, she had used that power of attorney to cash out the certificate early, eaten the early withdrawal penalty without a second thought, and moved the entire remaining balance south. I ran the total 3 separate times, because I genuinely did not believe it the first two. $465,000. That was the number sitting at the bottom of my column. $465,000, drained out of a man who ate toast he couldn't finish and wore the same flannel shirt for 15 straight years because, in his words, a good shirt shouldn't be wasted just for looking older. I thought about him at his kitchen table, writing 400 out on the 9th, didn't buy anything, apologizing, in his own private diary, for spending money he had never actually spent, while the whole time, nearly $500,000 was quietly walking out the back door behind his back. I closed the laptop very, very gently, because if I hadn't closed it gently, I would have thrown it across the room. I sat in the dark dining room for a long while and let that number settle all the way down into me. It didn't make me hysterical, the way I might have expected. It made me certain. There was still one thing I needed, the final confirmation that would turn my private spreadsheet into something a court would actually have to sit up and look at. And I knew exactly where to get it. The first person to call me after word got around that I was asking questions was my Uncle Dave, Denise's younger brother, and I made the mistake of assuming, right up until the moment he opened his mouth, that he'd be on my side in this. He'd always been the softer one growing up, the uncle who slipped me a $5 bill at Christmas when nobody else was looking and told me to buy myself something just for me. He started gentle. He'd heard I was upset about some money. He understood, he really did. But did I truly want to tear the whole family apart over Daddy's estate? I told him this wasn't about the estate. I told him she had drained Walter's accounts while the man was actively dying, for $165,000, and that I had the records to prove every dollar of it. There was a silence on the line, and I could actually hear him recalculating in real time, and it wasn't sympathy he was doing the math on. "Look, Colleen," he said finally, his voice thinner than I'd ever heard it. "Whatever happened, it stays in the family. You go to a court, you drag lawyers into it, there's nothing left for anybody at the end of that. Denise says there's supposed to be a share for me in this too, and for your aunt. Don't blow that up over old man's paperwork." And there it was. He wasn't afraid for Walter. He'd never once asked how Walter had suffered, or whether he'd been scared, or whether he'd known what was being done to him. He was afraid for his own cut. He was standing in the middle of a burning house, asking me not to call the fire department, in case the water damaged his half of the furniture. I told him I loved him, and I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back later. That was the first one to go. My own uncle, choosing a payout over the truth, choosing his sister's silence over his own father's stolen savings, without so much as a pause to grieve first. I stood at my window a long while after that call, and I understood something cold and clean settle into place. This was never going to be simply me against my mother. This was going to be me against everyone in that family who wanted a piece of what was left, and who was willing to call betrayal family business in order to keep it. I was already more alone in this than I'd been an hour earlier, and the hardest part hadn't even started yet. The one I truly didn't see coming was Sam. He waited until Nora was asleep, and then he sat down across from my spreadsheets with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never actually drank from, and he said the thing carefully, the way you handle a live wire you're not sure is grounded. "Colleen," he said. I love you, and I loved Walter like my own grandfather. But maybe we let this one go." I stared at him, and for a second I genuinely couldn't process the words in the order he'd said them. He kept going, gentle and reasonable and, in that moment, entirely wrong. "It's not our money," he said. "It never was ours to begin with. You go to war with your mother over this, and it's lawyers for years, and it's Nora growing up watching her mama tear herself apart over a dead man's bank account. He can't spend it now, Colleen. Let's protect what we've already got, and just walk away from the rest." I know he wasn't being cruel. I understood, even in the moment, that he was trying to be a good father, standing between our little family and a fire he was afraid would take all of us down with it. But it landed like a betrayal anyway, because it meant the one person I'd assumed would stand beside me without hesitation was, instead, asking me to sit back down. "It was never about the money, Sam," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's about a man who came to every single thing I ever did in my life. And his own daughter couldn't come to his funeral, because she was too busy spending what she'd already stolen from him. If I let that go, if I just walk away because it's easier, then showing up means absolutely nothing. Then love is just whatever people happen to say out loud when the will finally gets read." He looked at me for a long time. He didn't agree with me, not that night. He went up to bed eventually, and I stayed at the table alone with my grandfather's journal and $500,000 in stolen numbers and, for the first time since this whole thing began, not one single person standing beside me. And that was when I finally understood, fully and without flinching, what I was going to have to do, with or without anybody else's blessing. She moved faster than I ever expected her to. A week after that phone call, I drove out to Walter's house, mostly just to sit on the porch we'd painted together, no real plan beyond that. And there was a realtor's sign hammered into the front yard, and a lockbox bolted onto the door. She'd flown up, changed the locks, and put the house on the market before the flowers on his grave had even fully wilted. I stood in that gravel driveway where I'd parked 100 times over the years, and I could not get in. My grandfather's house, the only place on this entire earth that ever truly felt like home to me, and I was locked out of it by my own mother, who was in the process of selling it out from under a man not yet cold in the ground. There was a light on inside. I could see her moving behind the curtains, boxing up his life into cardboard like it was inventory. When she saw my car pull up, she came to the window, looked straight at me, and pulled the curtain shut. She didn't come to the door. She didn't say a single word. She just closed the curtain on me, the way you'd close it on a solicitor you didn't care to speak with. I stood there in the cold until the porch light, the one he always left on for me, every single night of my life, whether I was coming or not, clicked off. She turned off his light. That's the one detail out of this entire nightmare that I still can't quite shake, even now. For 27 years, that porch light was on for me whenever I came up that drive. And my own mother reached over, without a second's hesitation, and turned it off. I drove home with my jaw clenched so tight it ached for 2 days afterward. She was going to sell the house, pocket whatever she could get for it, salt the earth on her way out, and dare anyone in that whole town to say a single word about it, because who, in the end, actually takes their own mother to court? She was betting everything on the one thing that had kept me small my entire life. She was betting that I would stay quiet, the way I always had, in order to keep the peace. She bet wrong. When the quiet threat didn't move me, and I made sure, through Harold, that she knew it hadn't, she tried a much louder one. Denise called again, the first time she'd called me directly in weeks, and her voice had that rehearsed, overcome quality people get when a lawyer has coached them carefully beforehand on exactly what to say and how to say it. She'd heard I was talking to attorneys. She wanted me to understand something, she said, before I did anything I couldn't take back. If I came after her, she would tell everyone, the whole town, every last relative, anyone who would listen, the truth as she saw it. That I was the one who had manipulated a dying, confused old man. That I had wormed my way into his house and his affections over the years. That I had poisoned him against his own daughter, deliberately, patiently, for decades, and had cooked up these accusations now simply to steal an inheritance I had no actual blood right to in the first place. She said it so smoothly that I understood immediately she had said it out loud before, practicing, probably in a mirror, probably more than once. "You have no idea how this is going to look, Colleen," she said. "The charity case grandchild, all alone in the house with a sick old man, controlling all his money for months at a time. You throw one stone at me, and I will throw 10 right back." She was flipping the entire story on its head. In her version, the thief became the victim, and the granddaughter who showed up every single night for 27 years became the vulture circling a dying man's fortune. And the truly awful thing, the thing I had to sit with for a long while afterward, is that I understood it might actually work on people who didn't know the two of us at all. A jury doesn't automatically see 27 years of school recitals and softball games and folded gas station receipts. They see a will, and a woman, and a great deal of missing money, and they wonder. For about an hour after that call, I was genuinely afraid. Not of her exactly, but of the story she was capable of telling, and how convincing a confident, well-dressed liar can sound to people who have no other information to weigh it against. Then I remembered what I actually had in my hands. Not a story. Not a he said, she said. I had Walter's own handwriting, dated in his own failing hand, documenting what she was doing to him while it was still actively happening to him. I had a fiduciary who could not account for a single missing nickel under oath. I had numbers that don't grieve, and don't get confused, and don't change their story depending on who's listening. Let her throw 10 stones. I had the one that was actually true. Harold sent me to a woman named Patricia Ruiz, an elder law attorney who handled nothing else, and she was the first person in weeks who looked at my spreadsheet and my grandfather's journal side by side and didn't flinch even slightly. She spread it all across her desk, the journal, the statements, the power of attorney, the torn prescription pad note, and she read through everything for a full 20 minutes without saying a single word. Then she took off her glasses and set them down. "Mrs. Anderson," she said, "in my experience, cases like this are usually a fog. Somebody's confused. Records have gone missing over the years. It's one person's memory against another's, and there's rarely anything solid enough to hang a case on. This is not that. Your grandfather did your work for you, months in advance, before he even knew for certain he'd need it done. He documented his own exploitation in real time, in his own hand, and left you a paper trail so clean I could walk it into any courtroom in this state tomorrow morning." She explained the road ahead of me plainly, no softening it, exactly the way Harold had. First, a petition for a judicial accounting. The probate court would order Denise to justify every single transfer, under oath, within 30 days of being served. When she couldn't, and Patricia was already confident, from what she'd seen on the desk in front of her, that she wouldn't be able to, that failure itself became evidence of a breach of fiduciary duty. That made it civil, meaning restitution, and because there was clear evidence of bad faith rather than simple confusion, potentially double the amount taken as damages on top of the original sum. But past a certain dollar threshold, and $465,000 was well past it, this stopped being merely a family lawsuit and became something else entirely, financial exploitation of an elder. A felony. That meant a prosecutor. That meant a criminal record. That meant, if it went all the way, prison. She set down her pen and looked at me the same way Harold had, weeks earlier, in his cluttered little office above the hardware store. "You need to decide something before we file any of this," she said. "Because a judge cannot unring this bell once it's rung. And neither can you. Once I petition, your mother is on a track that ends in handcuffs if the evidence holds up the way I believe it will. And Mrs. Anderson, your evidence holds." I sat in that chair a long moment, feeling everything I had feared for weeks and everything I had quietly wanted collapse into the exact same object, sitting there on her desk between us. The road was real. It was fully paved. And every single mile of it ran directly, unavoidably, over my own mother. I told Patricia I needed one night before I signed anything, and I meant it completely. That night turned out to be the hardest of the entire ordeal, harder even than the funeral itself, because at the funeral there had been nothing left for me to decide. Everything that day had already been decided by other people, long before I arrived. This I had to choose myself, with my own hand, and live inside the choice afterward for the rest of my life. I sat at my dining table and let myself feel the full weight of it, all at once, without flinching away from any part of it. If I signed her papers, my mother, the woman whose face I had searched for at every single recital of my childhood and never once found in the crowd, would become a criminal defendant. She could go to prison. Whatever thin, mean, threadbare thread still connected the two of us would be cut for good, permanently, and I would be the one holding the scissors when it happened. There is a version of me, the 9-year-old version, the one still sitting in a gymnasium looking for a face that wasn't there, who would have set the pen down that night and made some kind of peace, and spent the rest of her life quietly grateful for whatever scraps got thrown her way afterward. And I sat there at that table, and I felt her pulling at me, that small girl who had always believed that if she was just good enough, and just quiet enough, her mother might finally, eventually, love her the way mothers were supposed to. Keep the peace. Don't make trouble. Earn it. And then I opened Walter's journal again, to the line I had already read 100 times by then. The line he had first said to a crying 9-year-old at a kitchen table, and had later written down, in his own failing hand, to a grieving grown woman he trusted more than anyone else on this earth. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. And I finally understood, completely and all at once, that I had had it backwards my entire life. I had thought showing up meant sitting in the chair no matter what was done to you, staying, enduring, keeping the peace at any cost to yourself. But Walter never once kept the peace with the truth, not really, not when it counted. He showed up for me, which meant, when it actually mattered, he stood between me and the people who would have hurt me if he'd let them. Showing up was never shrinking. It was standing. He had spent the very last of his strength standing up for me from inside a cigar box, when he had nothing left to stand with but a shaking hand and a torn scrap of paper. The very least I could do, the absolute least, was stand up for him now, out loud, where people could actually hear it. I closed the journal gently. I put that 9-year-old girl to bed, for the last time, as kindly as I knew how. And in the morning, I called Patricia and told her to file. We filed on a Thursday. I remember the day specifically because I took the morning off work and sat in Patricia's office while she walked me through each individual signature, one at a time, and every single one of them felt like closing a door behind me that I would never be able to open again. The petition for a judicial accounting, demanding Denise justify every transfer under oath. The report to Adult Protective Services, documenting the financial exploitation of Walter Kesler in plain, factual language. And an affidavit, my own sworn statement, my name at the very bottom of the page, testifying formally against my own mother. Patricia slid each page across the desk toward me one at a time, and I signed them steady, the carpenter's granddaughter with the accountant's hand, and I did not let a single one of them shake under my pen. When it was finished, she gathered all the papers into a folder and said quietly, "You understand there's no undoing this now. Once it's in front of the court, it belongs to the court, Colleen. Not to you anymore. If they decide to take it criminal, you cannot simply call it off later, no matter what happens between now and then." I told her I understood. And I truly did understand. I understood that I had just, with my own hand, ended whatever remained of the family I had left, and that the 2 empty chairs at the funeral had only ever been the very beginning of this. I understood that my uncle would likely never speak to me again, and my aunt, and probably half the people I had grown up around in that small town. I understood I was choosing a dead man over a living family, and that most people, hearing only the outline of it, would call me cold for that choice. I drove home genuinely terrified. Physically terrified, hands damp on the steering wheel the whole way. But underneath that terror was something else, something I hadn't felt in 27 years, and it took me a good while to be able to name it properly. It was relief. The very specific relief of a woman who has finally stopped auditioning for a love she was never actually going to be given, and has instead started standing on solid ground of her own choosing. The papers were filed. The bell was rung. And somewhere down in Florida, a certified letter was already on its way to a woman who had spent her entire life assuming her granddaughter would always stay quiet, no matter what was done to her. The letter reached her on a Monday. She called me that same night, and I let it go straight to voicemail, and then, once I'd steadied myself with a cup of tea I didn't drink much of, I made myself listen to the whole thing. The first 2 minutes were pure rage. She called me a viper. A liar. A nobody who had crawled in off the street as a child and eventually turned on the very family that had taken her in out of pity. She said I had always been jealous, always grasping, that Walter should have simply left me on the porch where he'd found me all those years ago and let the state deal with me instead. I stood in my kitchen and let it wash over me, and it didn't cut the way Charity Case had cut, weeks earlier. Somewhere along this whole road, her words had quietly lost their edge on me, the way a blade dulls with use even when you can't see it happening in the moment. Then, mid-sentence, the recording changed entirely. Her voice went soft, and wet, and pleading, the fastest hairpin turn I have ever heard a human voice make. "Sweetheart," she said. She had never once called me that in my entire life. Not once. That was his word, his alone, and hearing it come out of her mouth turned my stomach in a way the rage hadn't managed to. "Sweetheart, please. We can fix this. Family stays together, no matter what's happened. Drop the case, and you'll still have a mother. Think about Nora. Doesn't your little girl deserve to have a grandmother in her life?" And there it was. The oldest hook in the world, dressed up as tenderness. The exact bait that would have caught me completely at any earlier point in my life, hook and line and all. "You'll still have a mother." As though the word mother were some kind of gift she was generously offering me now, rather than a debt she had never once, in 34 years, made even a partial payment on. I deleted the voicemail. I did not call her back. I understood, finally and completely, that she wasn't sorry. I don't believe, to this day, that she has that particular capacity in her at all. She was cornered. And to a woman like Denise, being cornered and being sorry feel identical from the inside, so she reaches for the same soft voice either way, out of habit rather than out of any real change of heart. She would say absolutely anything to make the numbers go away. But the numbers weren't hers to make disappear anymore. They belonged to a judge now, and that judge was going to want every one of them explained, in writing, under oath, with no room left for a soft voice to talk her way around them. The 30 days ran out, and Denise's formal accounting came back to the court exactly the way Patricia had predicted it would, weeks earlier, sitting in her office. Thin. Defensive. Full of holes a person could drive a truck through. She had listed the transfers as caregiver reimbursements and family loans, with no receipts attached anywhere, no signed agreements of any kind, no proof whatsoever that Walter had ever actually agreed, in a moment of clear judgment, to a single dime of it. For a fiduciary, that isn't an explanation. That's a confession, just written in slightly better handwriting than a real confession usually gets. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Patricia and Harold and I sat together and built the file, piece by piece, laid into several nights. We laid Walter's journal open beside the bank statements and matched his shaky, handwritten notes to the actual recorded transfers, date for date, dollar for dollar. $400 out on the 9th, there it was on the statement, $400 transferred to Florida on the 9th, exactly as he'd written it down in his own failing hand while lying in a bed too weak to hold a spoon steady. $600 on the 15th, there it was too, matching perfectly. He hadn't just left me grief and a hunch to work from. He had left me a witness statement, written in his own hand while it was happening to him, that the bank's own cold, indifferent records confirmed line by line, entry by entry, with no gaps and no room for doubt. We built a simple exhibit out of all of it in the end. His words on the left-hand side of the page. The numbers on the right. The running total climbing steadily down to $465,000 at the very bottom. Patricia looked over the finished thing and told me, quietly, that she'd been practicing elder law for 30 years and had rarely if ever seen a cleaner case laid out in front of her. I should have felt triumphant, looking at it. Mostly, I just felt tired, and sad, and steady, all three at once, in a way that's hard to describe unless you've lived it yourself. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes on the chair in our bedroom, the way you would for a job interview or a wedding, and I read Walter's last line one more time before turning off the lamp. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them. And I'm sorry. Then I turned off the light. Tomorrow, I would sit in a courtroom directly across from my own mother and let the numbers he had kept, in his own hand, at the very end of his life, do the talking for both of us. I had stopped rehearsing what I might say to her weeks earlier. The entire point of everything I'd done, in the end, was that I no longer needed her to hear me say anything at all. The probate courtroom was small and paneled in the kind of wood Walter would have run his hand along just to check the grain before he'd ever trust it to hold weight. I sat at the table on the left with Patricia beside me. Harold sat in the row directly behind us. And behind him, in the gallery, sat the relatives, my Uncle Dave, who wouldn't meet my eyes even once the entire morning, my aunt, a cousin or two I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them there to watch. None of them there beside me. Then Denise and Roy came in, and I almost laughed out loud at the sight of them, because they had clearly dressed for it. She wore a cream-colored suit and a string of pearls, her tan gone gold and expensive-looking under the fluorescent courtroom lights. She walked in like a woman attending someone else's misfortune, not her own. Roy trailed a half-step behind her, still faintly sunburned, wearing a blazer that didn't quite fit through the shoulders. They had a lawyer with them in an expensive tie, and the three of them settled into their seats with the easy confidence of people who had genuinely never once, in their entire lives, been told no and made it stick. The judge called the proceeding to order. Patricia presented the petition, calm and thorough. Then Denise's lawyer stood up and did exactly what he'd been hired to do, which was to try to make $465,000 sound like a simple misunderstanding between loving relatives during a difficult time. He talked about a grieving family. A difficult illness. Informal arrangements made in good faith. The general messiness of caring for a dying parent, the way expenses blur together when everyone's exhausted and heartbroken. He was good at it. Genuinely smooth. And the entire time he talked, I watched the judge's eyes keep dropping down to the exhibit sitting on the bench in front of him, Walter's shaking handwriting on the left side of the page, the bank's cold, indifferent confirmation on the right, lined up date for date with nowhere left to hide between them. I watched the judge's face carefully, and I understood, somewhere around the third or fourth time his eyes made that same trip down the page, that the tie and the tan weren't going to be nearly enough to carry this. You cannot smooth-talk a running total. You cannot charm a spreadsheet into changing its mind. Denise had built her entire life, from what I could tell, on the belief that a confident enough voice could rewrite any number put in front of it. And she was about to sit in a room where, for once in her life, the numbers were going to get to speak last, without interruption. The judge called a short recess before issuing his ruling. That's when they made their move. Denise's lawyer caught Patricia out in the hallway and asked for a moment alone with just me. Against her own better judgment, Patricia allowed it, but stood right beside me the entire time, close enough to intervene if she needed to. The offer was surgical, clearly rehearsed. Denise would return a portion of the money, not all of it, only a portion, and this was meant to be the sweetener. She would sign Walter's house back over to me directly. My house. The porch we'd painted together. The moon-shaped nightlight still plugged into the wall of the spare room. The very light she herself had turned off on me weeks earlier. In exchange, I would withdraw the criminal referral entirely, drop my affidavit, and sign a confidentiality agreement keeping every bit of it inside the family. No prosecutor. No record. No one outside that hallway would ever need to know the full shape of what had actually happened. And then Denise herself stepped forward into the hallway, because apparently she couldn't help herself, couldn't let a lawyer handle the last word. She softened her whole face into something almost maternal, reached for my hand, and said the line she had clearly saved for exactly this moment. Take the house, sweetheart. Let's put all of this behind us. you'll still have a mother. And I stood there and felt the precise shape of the trap close around me, because it had been built out of absolutely everything I had ever wanted as a child. The house. Peace. A mother, even a deeply flawed, even a terrible one, instead of no mother at all. Everything 9-year-old me had ever quietly prayed for at night, offered to me right there on a hallway floor, in exchange for exactly one small thing. My silence. All I had to do was stay quiet, take the gift, and let her walk free. Keep the peace. The one thing I had practiced my entire life, better than almost anything else I've ever done. I looked down at my mother's outstretched hand. I looked over at Patricia, who said nothing at all, who let the whole decision sit entirely in my hands, where it belonged. And I felt, very clearly, 2 entire futures pulling at me from opposite directions at once. The warm, quiet one, where I got my house back and simply swallowed the truth whole, for good, and never spoke of any of it again. And the cold, clean one, where I lost absolutely everything material and kept only my word to a dead man. My grandfather came to every single thing I ever did in my whole life, without exception, for 27 years straight. The very least I could do in return was not sell him out in a courthouse hallway for the price of a set of keys. I took my hand back. No, I said. Just the one word. Quiet. The exact way he'd always taught me to say the things that mattered most. My mother's face went blank for a second, and then furious, because in her entire life, as far as I know, no one had ever once handed her a house and gotten a no in return. We went back into the courtroom. When Patricia offered the exhibits formally into the record, I asked the judge if I might be permitted to speak, and he allowed it. I did not raise my voice, not once, the entire time. I didn't need to. I stood up, and I laid it out the exact way I lay out an audit for any client, plainly, in order, with no heat behind any of it. I read Walter's own words first, straight from the journal. Money's tight, and I don't know why. She thinks I'm too far gone to count. I'm not. I just can't stop her. Then I matched each line, one at a time, to the bank's own confirmation, transfer by transfer, all the way up through the certificate of deposit cashed out early while he was too sick to sign his own name steady, all the way to $465,000. All the way up through the certificate of deposit cashed out early while he was too sick to sign his own name steady, all the way to $465,000. I told the court that this money had never once been mine to want, and that I hadn't come here to claim a single dollar of it for myself. I told them my grandfather had always meant that certificate of deposit for something good, his own words, and that I was asking the court to see it returned so it could go toward elderly people who had no one left to show up for them the way he'd shown up for me. Not to me. Not even to his house, which I intended to give outright to an elder care charity in his name, regardless of what the court decided about the money itself. And it was that, oddly, of everything said in that courtroom that morning, that finally broke Denise. Not the numbers. Not the exhibit. The part where I gave all of it away. She shot up out of her chair, and it came out of her before her own lawyer could catch her sleeve to stop it. It was owed to me, she shouted, loud enough that it echoed slightly off the paneled walls. It was mine. I earned it. I put up with that old man my whole life. The courtroom went completely silent. She had said it, out loud, in front of a sitting judge, on the record. And I just looked at her, calm, steady, entirely done, and I understood in that moment that I had won and lost the exact same thing in the exact same breath. I had my grandfather's honor back, fully, permanently. And I would never have a mother again, not really, not in any way that mattered. Both at once. That's the price nobody ever tells you comes as a single bill, due all at once, with no installment plan. The judge did not need long to decide. He found that Denise had breached her fiduciary duty in about as plain and undeniable terms as he said he'd seen in years on the bench, that the transfers had clearly served her interests and not the man she was legally sworn to protect, and that her own outburst moments earlier had spared everyone in the room the trouble of having to separately prove intent. He ordered full restitution of the $465,000, and because he found she had acted in demonstrated bad faith rather than mere confusion, he doubled that amount in damages on top of it. Then he did the one thing that could never be undone, no matter what happened afterward. He referred the entire matter to the county prosecutor for criminal charges, financial exploitation of an elder, a felony under state law. I watched it land on her, in real time, across that small courtroom. I watched the cream-colored suit and the expensive gold tan stop meaning anything at all, right there in front of everyone. Roy, my father, who had ridden her coattails all the way to that Caribbean beach and back, leaned visibly away from her in his ill-fitting blazer, already calculating, I could tell just from his posture, exactly how he might save himself once the prosecutor came calling. He always did travel light when it counted. Denise looked at me across that little courtroom, and for one single second the mask dropped entirely, and I saw something almost human underneath it. Not remorse, I genuinely don't believe she has that particular capacity, not for this, maybe not for anything. But fear. Real fear, for what might have been the first time in her adult life. The fear of a woman who had spent decades certain that competence alone could rewrite any number put in front of her, and who had just learned, in the space of one morning, that it couldn't. I didn't gloat. There was nothing in me that wanted to. I looked past her instead, to the empty chair at the end of our table, where Harold had quietly set Walter's blue journal, and I said it under my breath, just for him, not for the room. Numbers don't grieve. They just tell the truth. He had kept his own numbers all the way to the very end, in a shaking hand, so that one day this exact room would have to sit still and listen to them. And it had. The whole town had shown up for his funeral, every last person except the two who owed him the most. And now a courtroom full of strangers had heard his final words read aloud into the official record. The man who always showed up had, in the very end, gotten one last day in court of his own. I made certain of that much, at least. She found me on the courthouse steps afterward, because she couldn't let it end without taking the very last word for herself, the way she always had, at every stage of my whole life. Roy was already gone by then, off somewhere trying to find his own lawyer, already thinking only of himself the way I'd known he would. Denise came at me with her voice low and shaking, all the pretense finally burned clean off her. "I hope you're happy," she hissed. "You destroyed this family. You took everything from me. You were never even one of us, not really, no matter what he told you." And I stood there on those steps, in the gray afternoon light, and for the first time in 34 years I felt absolutely nothing she was capable of reaching anymore. No fear. No leftover hunger for her approval. No 9-year-old still standing at the edge of a gymnasium, quietly waiting to be chosen. I looked at my mother, and I said the only thing left that was true. "I didn't take anything from you," I told her. "You took it from him." I just wrote it down. Then I told her, without any heat left in my voice at all, that I would not be speaking with her again, that she was not to contact me or Nora going forward, and that if she tried, my lawyer would handle it from there on out. I set the boundary the exact way you'd close a ledger that has finally, after a great deal of work, come out balanced, quietly, cleanly, done. She opened her mouth to fire something back at me, and there was simply nothing left to fire at, so she just stood there on those steps with her mouth slightly open and nothing coming out. And for once in her entire life, as far as I have ever known her, Denise Anderson had no line ready to reach for. I walked down the steps, and I did not look back at her, not once. And the strangest part of the whole day was how light I felt walking to my car. Not happy, you don't get to feel happy at the end of something like this, and I think anyone who tells you otherwise has never actually lived through it. But free. Free of a debt I had been quietly trying to pay off my entire life, to a woman who was never, under any circumstances, going to consider the account settled. I got in my car. Sam was waiting for me at home. And I drove toward the people who actually show up. Ending you might see in a courtroom drama on television. Denise ultimately took a plea deal rather than risk a jury trial, and served time for felony exploitation of an elder, with restitution ordered on top of whatever sentence she received. Roy flipped exactly the way I always knew he would the moment things got difficult, testified against her in exchange for leniency, and walked away with probation and a reputation nobody in that entire town will ever fully forget, not in his lifetime. My Uncle Dave got the silence he'd asked me for, weeks earlier, on that first phone call, and it cost him a niece in the process. We haven't spoken since. I've made my peace with that particular loss, slowly, the way you make peace with any wound that simply isn't going to close all the way. The doubled restitution came through in pieces over the following year, arriving in installments through the court, and I did not keep a single dollar of it for myself. Every cent, plus the eventual sale proceeds of the certificate of deposit, went straight into a small fund I set up in his name, the Walter Kesler Fund, for elderly people who have no family left to show up for them the way he showed up for me. It pays for rides to chemo appointments for people who'd otherwise have to skip them. It pays, in a very real sense, for someone to simply sit in the chair. And the house, the one she had tried to sell out from under him before his flowers had even wilted, I signed over entirely to an elder care charity, so that the place where one lonely little girl once got a moon-shaped nightlight would go on sheltering people that nobody else came for. My mother once told me I was his charity case, not his blood. She meant it as the cruelest thing she could possibly find to say to me in that moment. I think about that sentence now, every single time I sign a check drawn from that fund, and I have to smile a little, because in a strange way she was almost right. I was raised by charity, the real kind, the kind that actually shows up, and stays, and doesn't ask anything back in return. And I grew up to run some of my own. On the day we formally handed the house over to the charity, I took Sam and Nora out there with me one last time, just the three of us. Sam had come around long before the hearing ever ended, once he'd sat with it a while and let himself really feel what was actually being asked of me. He told me afterward, months later, that watching me refuse that house in a courthouse hallway had been the exact moment he finally understood he'd married a woman with a spine made out of the same oak as her grandfather's. He held my hand on the porch we'd painted together all those years ago. Nora, 6 years old and utterly fearless, ran the full length of the yard the way I used to as a girl, and the porch light was burning, because I'd driven out the week before, by myself, and put a new bulb in the fixture, and left it on. We sat together on the top step, the three of us in a row, and I opened Walter's blue journal to its very last page, and I read my daughter the final line her great-grandfather had ever written down. If you're reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them. And I'm sorry. Nora asked me, in the simple, direct way only a 6-year-old can manage, who he had been sorry to. I told her the truth. I said he was sorry that the people who were supposed to love him hadn't shown up for him the way they should have. Then I told her the other truth too, the bigger one underneath it. I told her that one person had shown up for me my entire life, without fail, and that his showing up was the whole reason her own mama had ever learned how to stand up straight for anything at all. Nora didn't fully understand, not yet. She's 6. But she'll have that journal one day, when she's older, and she'll understand it completely then, the way I finally did. Here's the only thing I know for certain now, after all of it. Love is not what people say out loud when it will finally gets read to an empty room. It is not a caption typed underneath a beach photo, or a birthday card that happens to arrive during the correct month. Love is who is sitting in the chair when no one else is watching, and nothing at all is owed to them in return. My grandfather sat in that chair for my entire life, without exception, without complaint, without once asking to be repaid for it. And in the end, the only thing he ever truly asked of me, the one debt he actually called in, was to show up for him the same way he had always shown up for me. Showing up is the whole thing. 2 empty chairs. A photo from a beach. A blue journal hidden in a cigar box. That's what betrayal looked like inside my family. And standing up to it, finally, after 34 years of staying quiet, is what set me free. If someone in your own life has always shown up for you, no matter what it cost them, go tell them today, before the chairs are empty and it's too late to say it out loud. And if this story moved you even a little, subscribe to Calm Drama Stories and stay with us, Because there are more women here who finally stopped shrinking. Maybe the next one is you.